So the topic of afterlife, as you know, is one of the most pressing on a personal level because we all know we will die. Some of us accept that, some of us deny that. We don't know when that's going to happen. Some of us accept that and some of us deny that. But it's one of those questions, I find it to be one of the first questions people ask when they want to know what is Judaism about, right? Sometimes it's a Jew who wants to know what the religion is about, and sometimes it's a non-Jew. And we'll come back to this point of why does this question concern us so much? And for anyone who takes the idea seriously, at the least as a thought experiment, the idea of there being an eternity or an eternal existence is both a very scary and a very promising idea. So I want to make some simple statements first, which you probably already know, but they're basic ideas around the Jewish approach to afterlife. And then I want to make things really complicated and go through a lot of sources over the next couple sessions that show the complexity and the nuances of how Jewish thinkers have thought about this issue. I'm not so interested in this series on the broader philosophical proofs or tensions or principles. I'm also not concerned with the sociological factors of what Jews believe. Rather, I'm interested in sharing what the Jewish tradition has proposed and shared from the biblical era through the Talmudic era, through the halachic areas up till today. And I'm also, this ought to be obvious, not taking a persuasive role. I don't have any agenda other than to inform us of the sources of around afterlife. I also don't intend to propose one theorist over another. There's a whole range from the rationalist philosophers to the Kabbalists and mystics who have taken completely different perspectives. So from the start, a couple principles which I feel comfortable stating. First is that Jewish thought is unequivocal that there is an afterlife. There shouldn't be any statement that or any question as to whether Judaism as a philosophy and a tradition accepts it or not. It is clear throughout the text that Judaism embraces an afterlife. That's number one. Number two, it's clear that the afterlife has a key role in Jewish theology. This is alluded to very differently in different Jewish texts, from the Torah to the Nach, the prophets, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Kabbalah, in very different ways. And it's hard to say there is a Jewish approach to afterlife. Rather, like everything, there are many, many Jewish approaches to the issue. Thirdly, there is a strong tradition both of reward and punishment, as commonly called heaven and hell. We'll have more nuanced terms to talk about this, but both of those exist in the tradition. Fourthly, there are those who propose, and we hear this often, that the main Jewish approach is that this life has more importance to focus on than the next one. Right? Y'all heard that often before? That our focus is on this. However, there's another strand of thought, we see this in Mesilas Yesharim and other mystics, that this life, the purpose of human existence, is preparation for the next world. There is a very strong line of thought that says that is the raison d'etre, that is the purpose of human existence, that we prepare our souls for Olam Haba, for the next world. Fifthly, there is a general conviction that non-Jews have a place in the afterlife. If you have one of the pages I gave you, we're not going to spend time on it. It's only on Hebrew. It's the only source I gave to you only in Hebrew. We see in the Tosefta. The Tosefta are the extra sources that didn't make it into the Talmud, and so they were compiled into something else called the Tosefta. And the very last line, for those who read Hebrew, says, Yesh tzadikim ba'ovdei kochavim sheyesh lehem chelek leolam haba. This is a fascinating source that those the righteous of the idolaters, they have a portion in the world to come. Now, it's not clear this is the original text. There was a lot of tampering with text that had to do with Jews and non-Jews, Jewish approaches to Jesus, to other religions. It's not clear that Ovdei Kokavim, star worshippers, was the original text here in the Tosefta. But nonetheless, this is a pretty radical statement that even if one, according to these rabbis, got it theologically wrong, right? They worship the stars. Nonetheless, the fact that they are righteous, they are good people, they have a place in the world to come. Now, it's crucial to know that the Rambam in Hilchot Malachim, that's Maimonides, the greatest of Jewish philosophers, says in Hilchot Malachim 8:11 that the Chasidei Umot HaOlam yesh lehem chelek Olam Haba. The righteous of the nations have a portion in the world to come. So it is very easy to say, based upon the sources, that Judaism not unequivocally, but dominantly embraces the notion that good people, regardless of their faith, have a place in the world to come. Sixthly, as an opener, there seems to be a commitment, but this will be challenged also, that doing mitzvot, for Jews to do Jewish acts of goodness, as they're broadly defined, and following the ways of Torah, is the way that one primarily gets this Olam Haba, this world to come. Now, something I would argue today is that most people, I think, believe they are good people today. And I think most people believe they are deserving of the world to come. And I think that very few today, in the 21st century, feel a deep fear of eternal punishment, since there is, I think, some inflated sense of self-virtue. I want to compare this, what I proposed, to what we see in Rabbi Yochanan. If you'll turn to Brachot 28b, if you have that page. Brachot 28b. This is the way we see this type of passage in the Talmud all the time. And here's how Rabbi Yochanan experienced his own existential angst. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai fell ill, his disciples went in to visit him. When he saw them, he began to weep. His disciples said to him, "Lamp of Israel, pillar of the right hand, mighty hammer, wherefore weepest thou?" Why are you crying? He replied, "If I were being taken today before a human king, who is here today and tomorrow in the grave, whose anger, if he is angry with me, does not last forever? Who, if he imprisons me, does not imprison me forever? And who, if he puts me to death, does not put me to everlasting death? And whom I can persuade with words and bribe with money, even so I would weep." So he says, in this world, nobody can really harm me. He goes on, but now that I'm being taken, I'm about to die, one of the greatest rabbis of his era. Now that I'm being taken before the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, who lives and endures forever and ever, whose anger, if He is angry with me, is an everlasting anger, who, if He imprisons me forever, who, if He puts me to death forever, and whom I cannot persuade with words or bribe with money, nay more, when there are two ways before me, one leading to paradise and one to Gehenna. Right? He sees this notion of heaven and hell already here. Gehenna is one notion of hell we'll talk about. And I do not know by which I shall be taken. Shall I not cry? Shall I not weep? They said to him, "Master, bless us." He said to them, "May it be God's will that the fear of heaven shall be upon you like the fear of flesh and blood." His notion of yirat shamayim. His disciples said to him, "Is that all?" He said to them, "If only you can attain this fear of heaven, you can see how important this is. For when a man wants to commit a transgression, he says, 'I hope no man will see me.'" And so we see this notion in Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, this notion that he, as a virtuous person, feels a tremendous amount of fear about where he's going to go. And I think for some reason, we could say better or worse, this fear is lost in a lot of ways in 21st century. The rabbis are clear that we should not be driven towards virtue or towards derech tov, towards a good path, based upon our hope for reward and our fear of punishment. That is they call it an immature theological drive. But nonetheless, this constant awareness that we exist for a split second within eternity. And if we lack that awareness, we are potentially led down a dangerous path. We know from Dostoevsky this notion very well, that one can not believe in God and be moral, and one can be a believer in God and be very immoral. This is an obvious truth, I think. But we also know that this notion that I am in a room alone, and someone can still see me is a tremendously powerful theological motive for what he's calling yirat shamayim, a fear of the heavens, the sense that at the end of the day we will be judged. If you'll turn to our next page, that's a topsy-turvy world, if you have that. Again, if you don't have the sheet, it's totally fine. Just before this, I'm reminded, anyone read the magazine, the New Yorker? Read the New Yorker? So in the New Yorker, there was a cartoon that I liked that I saw recently. It had a celebrity, and she was standing at the gates of heaven, and there's an angel there blocking her entry into the heaven. And this woman standing there, a celebrity, saying, "But does he know who I am?" Right? Does he know who I am? Right? And I think there's this sense that I'm important. I am a good person. Right? Of course, this is secure for me. I think sometimes, it's good to have a sense of self-worth, but I think sometimes this confidence with our own virtue is sometimes an impediment to thinking in more nuanced ways about this larger eternity. So Rabbi Mark Angel, in his book The Rat Race, talks about a certain Gemara and about a person who died and came back. Anyone ever read these studies or read a book about someone who claims to have died and come back? I think it's on 60 Minutes every other week, right? Someone who experienced, and then there's these scientists, they interviewed 100 people, and all 100 experienced the same thing. There was light, right? And then there was somebody welcoming a hand. There was a hand welcoming them, someone they loved, right? So we hear things like this, we don't know what to do with it. Okay, we're going to come back to that issue, dying and coming back. But there is a Gemara that plays with this idea. And here's what Rabbi Angel wrote. The Talmud in Pesachim 50a, relates the story of the seeming death of a son of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Obviously, the family was mourning the passing of such a promising and learned young man, but then the son was somehow revived, and the joy was great. Rabbi Yehoshua realized, though, that his son had just had an amazing experience. He had died and thus had experienced life after death. And yet he was now alive and could describe what he had seen while he was in the next world. "What did you see there?" the rabbi asked his son. "I saw a topsy-turvy world. Those who are great here are small there. Those who are small here are great there." Rabbi Yehoshua told his son, "You have seen the world in its genuine clarity." "No, my son," he was saying, "you did not see an inverted world. You saw true reality. In this world, humans often misjudge who is actually great or insignificant, powerful or weak. But these misjudgments are rectified in the next world, the true world." Now, I find this passage interesting for a number of reasons. One, because there is a certain notion that one should limit their kavod, their honor, and their benefit in this world, because that will take away from reward in the next world. And so too, and we see this more in Christianity, but suffering in this world helps one to secure more gain in the next world. But much more what this is talking about than a reward and punishment model, I would suggest, is that that the merits and virtues that we as humans judge as the most important, these rabbis are suggesting are not the most important. The people who are most honored in this world are honored for things which, at the gates of heaven, so to speak, are not the top virtues. And so one of our explorations are going to be, through the Talmud, is what are these things that they are saying are so crucial? What is this Jewish belief that there are certain set of characteristics or convictions or practices that secure someone? And why is that so different, according to them, from what we seem to, from the types of things we seem to value and honor in our society today? And so some of the questions we're going to ask are, one, what is this afterlife? Two, who has access to it and who doesn't? And three, what is the weight or significance on thinking about this and exploring it within our own lives? Now, I'm just jumping from text to text and generation to generation, but there's so much to cover, and so I want to briefly look at the Zohar, one passage of the Zohar. If you have it, it has Hebrew on top and then English below it. It looks like this. And this is from Again, the Zohar is the main work of Kabbalah. I'm not talking about Madonna's Kabbalah, but like those who are, really learning the deep mystical tradition of Judaism. It would be great to start a class here in Zohar, actually. There's a lot of fascinating stuff here. And there are hundreds of passages dealing with this question in the Zohar. I only picked 2 for tonight. And this first one is from Parshat Yitro, the Torah portion of Yitro. Page Ayin Vav on the first side. And here's what it said in the Zohar. When man was created, what is written concerning him? You have clothed me with skin and flesh. From the book of Eov, from the book of Job. He asks, if so, what is man in his essence? And he answers, if you think that man is nothing more than skin, flesh, bones, and sinews, this is not so. For certainly man is but his soul. Zahavadai ha'adam lav ihu ela nishmata. Right? Man is only his soul. And skin, flesh, bones, and sinews area are only the clothing. These are the implements of man and not man himself. And when man passes away, he divests himself of all these implements that he wore. And so the main approach the Kabbalistic tradition is going to take is that we have klipot, we have shells surrounding us. We have false worlds around us and false perceptions, where we come to believe we are our skin and bones. We come to believe that who we are is our body. And what they're ultimately saying is there is an eternal part to each person. That is called the soul. And there's 5 parts to this soul. And the Tanya, which we'll look at, the Tanya, the work of the Alter Rebbe, from the Lubavitch tradition, will explore these 5 different levels of soul, which are connected to embodiment and which are separate from body. As you know, in the academy today, or really for thousands of years, but today it's sort of intensified. There's a great debate about body and soul, or I guess Plato, when he talked about the mind, referred to it as soul. But you'll have a thinker like Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, who will suggest there is only brain, right? There is nothing beyond brain. There's no experience beyond that. And then you'll have others who will, through their own neuroscience, explain that there's a part of the brain that's activated when there is this other experience people call a spiritual experience. And people use that as a proof one way or the other. But it's an age-old question of what is this thing that is outside of the body? What is this thing that potentially lives after the body fails? And so the position of the Zohar is that our nature is eternal, and that we are souls. We are ultimately this spark off of the candle that has been embodied, and at the end of this life, that spark merely returns to its bonfire. It returns to its candle. And so the one question that emerges there is there any identity or memory that remains with that soul? What is this soul of ours? And Rambam, in the rationalist tradition, will have a very different approach to this than the Kabbalah will. Okay, I want to move on to the sheet that has the biblical passage on top. It says the death of Abraham. It has writing on the front and back. If you have it, if not, that's fine. And what we learn in the biblical tradition is that man is born immortal. What do I mean by that? Man is born immortal in the Bible. Right? Adam and Eve are not supposed to die. Right? We see that one of the punishments, if it's interpreted as a punishment, from the first sin of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is that they lose their immortality. However, Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. Remember, the Garden of Eden is only one section of Eden. Eden is a larger community, and then there's a small garden within Eden, the Talmud explains. And we see over in Bereshit, in Genesis 3:23-24, in this radical statement, once they're expelled, the Garden of Eden is guarded by the cheruvim and the flame of the ever-turning sword, to guard the way to the tree of life. So we see that some angel is put in place to guard this paradise, this Garden of Eden, to guard this this place of immortality. And one of the ideas there is that the Garden of Eden is not destroyed, it is merely guarded in this world. That is to say that immortality was not ended, it merely was guarded. And so that was sort of the theological shift, as we see in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, from being immortal in this world to guarding immortality based upon certain principles. Now, this first source I brought here is the death of Abraham, the death of Abraham. And what it says here in chapter 25, verses 7 to 8, "Now these are the days of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 100 years, 70 years, and 5 years. And Abraham expired and died at a good old age, mature and content, and he was gathered to his people. V'ye'asef el amav." He was gathered to his people. And this whole question emerges, what does this mean? V'ye'asef el amav. He was gathered to his people. Now, one of the greatest biblical scholars of the 20th century was Nahum Sarna. Anyone heard of Nahum Sarna? His son was just speaking at Bnei Yehuda. Jonathan Sarna. He's the great American historian at Brandeis. Nahum Sarna was tremendous, and this bottom passage, if you have it in front of you, from the JPS Torah commentary, he explains these 3 words, V'ye'asef el amav, that Abraham was gathered to his people. And he says, this phrase is peculiar to the Torah. It is also used only in the cases of Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, Aaron, and Moses. An analysis of the context in which it is found reveals that it is to be distinguished from death itself, because the action follows the demise. It is not the same as burial in an ancestral grave, because it is employed of Abraham, Aaron, and Moshe, none of whom was buried with their forefathers. They were all buried in unique places, we learn. It is also not identical with interment in general, because the report of burial follows this phrase. And the difference between the two is especially blatant in the case of Jacob, who was interred quite a while after being gathered to his kin. They're saying this phrase is not talking about burial. That Abraham was gathered to his people does not mean he's buried with them. It would seem, therefore, that the existence of this idiom, as of the corresponding figure to lie down with one's fathers, testifies to a belief that despite his mortality and perishability, man possesses an immortal element that survives the loss of life. Death is looked upon as a transition to an afterlife where one is united with one's ancestors. This interpretation contradicts the widespread but apparently erroneous view that such a notion is unknown in Israel until later times. Now, I bring this source because there is a school of thought which claims that the notion of afterlife is not clear until the Talmudic era. It's not until the rabbis explain that and go to great length trying to understand the afterlife that this conviction exists. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought says, no, this idea is throughout the Torah. And those who follow that line of thought say, right here in the Bible from the case of Abraham, clearly that phrase is indicating that he is returning to his people. He is returning to a place of souls. A place of souls. And so if someone said to you, what's the earliest source you can find in the Torah for an afterlife, one would say, chapter 25, Abraham returns to his people. V'ye'asef el amav. Okay. Now, I want to look at, on the back side of this, in Brachot 17, in the Gemara, there's one explanation of what this afterlife is. We're going to come back to many different notions of this. In night 1, we're kind of jumping around between text and ideas, and then we're going to make it a little bit more systemic. So here's what it says in this fascinating Gemara, in this Talmudic passage in Brachot. It says, Margala befumei de Rav. The following was a familiar lesson in the mouth of Rav. Meaning he talked about this all the time. Lo ka'olam hazeh ha'olam haba. The world to come is not like this world. Ha'olam haba ein bo lo achila v'lo shtiya. In the world to come, there is no eating or drinking. V'lo pirya v'rivya v'lo masa umatan. There is no piru or vu. There is no sex. There is no reproduction, and there is no business. V'lo kina v'lo sina velo tachrut. There is no jealousy, there is no hatred, and there is no rivalry. Ela tzadikim yoshevin va'atrotehem barashehem. Rather, the righteous sit with their crowns on their heads. V'nanim miziv hashchina. And they delight in the radiance of the divine presence. Shene'emar v'yechazu et ha'elohim v'yochlu v'yishtu. They gazed at God and they ate and drank. So basically, the claim in this Talmudic passage is that there are no physical needs, there are no emotions, or at least certain emotions. And the fundamental experience is radically different from the experience we understand today in this world. Now, according to this, probably a joke, but to some this is heaven and to some this is hell, right? To some it's, whoa, no food, no sex, no competition, no hatred, right? I mean, who doesn't love to hate someone or something, right? So what is this place I'm being sent to? Is this heaven or hell, right? And for others, and I've got to sit there by the radiance of the divine presence. What am I going to do all day? Is the Chiefs game on? I don't know if that's heaven or hell either. But we're actually going to our first game in 2 weeks, so that we'll tell you then. But we see here some notion that people are sitting at this table of learning. People are sitting at this radiance of the divine presence, and that is supposed to be a rewarding experience. Now, just before your comments, some will explain that this is a reward-punishment model. You have a seat at the table if you lived a good life. Others will explain, and we'll flesh this out more later, that this is not a reward and punishment model. It's merely if one has a soul that appreciates and experience the divine presence, then naturally it will remain in that state. And if they haven't, it won't remain there. That statement I'm going to unpack in class 2 quite a bit. Quick question? Yeah.
Yeah. In the beginning of this paragraph, it says there's no eating and drinking, but it ends saying they ate and they drank.
Right. That is a good point, because it is the source they're bringing to prove, one of the sources they're bringing that they're relying upon. As you know well, one of the fundamental differences between Jewish and Christian hermeneutics is that Jews don't take text literally. We hardly ever take the Bible literally. That's why we have an oral tradition in addition to a written tradition. And what verses mean is not the literal sense. You would read that and say, they gazed at God and they ate and drank. Now actually, and say that means in the next world this is a place of physical consumption. But this is actually dealing with a case of shame. That in the desert, they had an encounter of God, and they were eating and drinking, and this was considered the antithesis of the spiritual completion of a true unification with God. And so that was used as an example to say, wow, look how far they were in the desert from being able to connect to God. In the real connection, there is no need or desire for those things. And so they're using that text. It's interesting they don't even explain how they're doing that. But they're using that text to show that, look, in an experience where one wasn't truly in front of the divine presence, they were eating and drinking, in the real experience, that won't exist. And so we see one notion here of the heaven, so to speak, that proposes Olam Haba is a place that lacks embodiment. It lacks physical needs and wants. It lacks the emotions that we exist in today. And of course, the question can be raised, well, once again, what about that is me? I spend my day working, and then I eat, and then I sleep, and maybe there's sex involved, and maybe there's competition involved, and then there's a little conflict. I'm just human. And what about this next world is anything like the way that I exist in this world? And we're going to explore that idea more. What is this experience we're talking about of Na'anin Miziv HaShekhinah, a delight, an enjoyment in the divine presence. Okay, we go to our next Zohar passage, which is in 399b on the bottom of that page. And here we see a very important notion of transmigration. Gilgulim. Anyone know what Gilgulim is? Reincarnation. There is a Jewish notion of reincarnation, and we will explore that more in either the second or third section of how the Kabbalists understand Gilgulim. And here's one notion that the Zohar raises about Gilgulim. And I actually, it's an incredibly fascinating literature around the Jewish approach to reincarnation, with a very late development in Jewish thought in terms of taking it very seriously, but then a great emergence of creativity and of meditation around this idea. The Zohar says, truly all souls must undergo transmigration. All souls must be recycled. But men do not perceive the ways, again, I'm sorry for the gendered language. A lot of these texts, when it says man or men, of course it means both. And I'm sorry if that's a barrier for anyone to connect. Truly all souls must undergo transmigration, but men do not perceive the ways of the Holy One. How the revolving scale is set up, and men are judged every day at all times, and how they are brought up before the tribunal, both before they enter into this world and after they leave it. They perceive not the many transmigrations and the many mysterious works which the Holy One accomplishes with many naked souls, and how many naked spirits roam about in the other world without being able to enter within the veil of the king's palace. This notion of naked souls comes up a lot in the Zohar. This notion that we are totally exposed in judgment, that our potential is exposed. Not only, it's not a question of just having done right or wrong, but how much could we have achieved in our lives and miss that potential. Our intentions are exposed, and our secrets are exposed. So the Zohar is fascinated with this idea of naked souls, being in a place where nothing can be hidden from exposure. In any sense. And this notion of transmigration, as we'll come back to, is a sense that it's not merely about reward and punishment, but a need for the perfection of every soul. And so the souls will be recycled until that is achieved. Okay, so that's that one thing on the Zohar. We're going to come back to that. Any quick questions before we? Yes.
As much as anybody, I would like to believe that there's a hereafter, and we see the people we love and reunited and all those enticements. It's agreed that we leave our bodies here. If heaven exists, hope it does, every soul who was good and went to heaven must be there. You won't see their hair, their eyes, their body, their clothes. So how do our souls recognize or have any
Okay, good.
existence with?
Okay, good. I intend to come back to that question and hold me accountable to it, Seymour, if I don't. Because I want to come back. And it goes without saying, and this probably should have been in my opening remarks as well, that I don't know anything. I know as much as everyone else. I've never been anywhere. I don't have any extra divine access. All I can do are quote the sources of our tradition. So everything is presented in a spirit both of humility, of curiosity, and of epistemic uncertainty. I won't say relativism. I think these ideas matter very much, and I'm very persuaded by the Jewish ideas. But to answer these great questions like that, all I can do is say what the greatest Jewish minds have said over time. Okay, let's hold questions and thoughts. I want to say our last sheet, and then we're going to, and then we'll take some closing questions and thoughts before we wrap up. I like to start and end on time. So I'm sorry we started 5 minutes late today. Okay, Sanhedrin, the sheet that says Babylonian Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin. This is called Perek HaChelek. This is called the chapter of who gets a place in the world to come. It's one of the most famous chapters in all of the Talmud. And it is very troubling in a lot of its language, but there is a whole list that is extrapolated of who gets the world to come and who doesn't. And I would suggest one way to approach the statements of person X has a chelik le'olam haba, has a place in the world to come, and person Y does not, is literal. That the rabbis are very serious, and they think if you do X, you are banned from this eternal world, and if you do Y, you receive this reward. The other way to explain it is that it's a pedagogical statement. The rabbis don't have that level of certainty of in the Talmud of who has what, but and they're not even attempting to claim that this person has got it and they haven't. But it is a literary device. It is a pedagogical tool to emphasize what is virtue and what is vice. Person X has a place in the world to come. Person Y doesn't. They are expressing an educational message. So we see here, right, one of the most famous statements in all of the Mishnah. It says, all of Israel have a portion in the world to come. Now, that statement implies that merely being Jewish secures someone in Olam Haba. Now, this will be debated, of course, about what that means and how that's understood. Because the opposite approach emerges as well, which is that it is harder for a Jew to get a place in the world to come than a non-Jew. Because non-Jews have 7 commandments. The mitzvot Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. That's all they have to do. And Jews are expected, according to the Jewish tradition, to fulfill 613 mitzvot. And so this is one of the sources of why we try to discourage people from converting. Like, look, you have it easy. Your expectations are pretty low. Embrace that and be happy about it. And as Jews, we have a higher bar set for us. We believe we have a specific mission in the world. We're held accountable to a different level, a different potential. Not necessarily better, but a different one. But here we see the statement in the beginning of the Mishnah of Sanhedrin that all of Israel have a portion in the world to come. And it continues, for it is written, thy people are all righteous. Now this is also an assumption, that if one is Jewish, they are righteous. Now, one way to interpret this is that they actually believe in some naivete that all Jews are good. Right? The other approach is that they're saying, and we see this throughout the Talmud, that once one has crossed the line morally and halachically, they're no longer considered Jewish anymore. Now, we don't talk like that anymore, but there was a sense that if one lost compassion from their lives, they're no longer considered part of the Jewish people. If one started to embrace a whole different theological truth, they're no longer part of the Jewish people. And so to be a Jew means that you're a good Jew, so to speak. And so they're saying that all Jews are righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, that I may be glorified. Don't worry about that part. But the following have no portion therein. He who maintains that resurrection is not a biblical doctrine, the Torah was not divinely revealed, and an apikoros. This is a radical statement in the Mishnah. They are saying that one who denies redemption, one who denies revelation, and one who denies the tenets of faith, of Jewish faith, do not have a portion in the world to come. That ultimately one of the questions at the gate is, did you believe the truths that were necessary to be present at the next stage? Now, one way to approach that again is reward and punishment. You believe the right things, you're rewarded. You believe the wrong things, you're punished. The other approach is that to actually sit at the table, you have to have had a soul that embraces the reality of that table. If your soul emerges and it doesn't recognize this divine table, then it simply fades into oblivion. It doesn't have any connection that has any lasting eternal impact. Rabbi Akiva added, one who reads uncanonical books. So he was seen to be very concerned with what one filled their mind and soul with. Also, one who whispers a charm over a wound and says, I will bring none of these diseases upon thee, which I brought upon the Egyptians. I'm assuming we're all doing that on Sunday mornings. For I am the Lord that healeth thee. Abba Shaul says, also one who pronounces the divine name as it is spelled. And so that is in the first Mishnah of Perek Kehilath, in this tractate in Sanhedrin, the list of some of the main characteristics of who's in and who's out. And now they go on to identify individuals, and I'll let you read this another time, who are denied the world to come. And they go through a whole list of individuals. And then on the back side, if you have it, they list 8 different historical groups that are also denied. First they say, and this is pretty radical, the generation of the flood have no share in the world to come. Then they say, a couple lines down, the generation of the dispersion. Who's the generation of the dispersion? The Tower of Babel, right? They disperse everyone. They have no place in the world to come. Then the men of Sodom, of Sodom, have no share in the world to come. Going down, you can read later, the spies have no share in the world to come. The generation of the wilderness, that means all the people in the desert who came out of Egypt have no world to come, they say. And then the company of Korach, no place. The 10 tribes shall never return again. And then ultimately the apostate city has no place in the world to come. So one of the roles the rabbis see themselves playing is they want to scare everyone. They believe that one of the greatest motivations towards the common people upping their game in life, and not merely working, eating, sleeping, but actually committing their lives to the highest level of virtue, is to constantly remind them that there is an eternity after this short blip of existence, and if we don't do the right things in this world, we're not going to get there. And in fact, some of the greatest parts of our ancestors didn't even make it there. And that's sort of interesting because we just learned that all of Israel has a place in the world to come. Well, some of this precedes Mount Sinai, when you could say Israel is defined. So the rabbis here are trying to startle us. And one of the things that's interesting here is that generally Olam Haba, the world to come, is based upon mitzvot, upon actions. But here we see beliefs. We generally say Judaism's entryway into the afterlife is about actions, not beliefs. And Christianity, and again, this is not comparative, but occasionally I'll make a comparison, and hopefully not flippantly, and if I do, you'll challenge me, that generally major strands of Christianity propose, if you simply believe X, you're secure. And now others will say, no, it's not that simple. There's more to it than that. Other Christian theologians. But in Judaism, generally we say, even if one didn't believe X, Y, and Z, but they were a great person, there's a place. But here we see a sense that if you got it theologically wrong, there is a consequence for that. And I put this out, again, not for any matter of persuading one way or another, but merely to understand the complexity of all the different sources, how they understand Olam Haba. So I want to just, I'm going to wrap up for a minute, and then take a couple closing questions, mostly which I'll punt for next session, but there might be a couple that I pick up. So just to say what we've said already, we have said that the Tosefta, the Talmudic tradition, and the Rambam embrace the notion that non-Jews have a place in the world to come along with Jews. Even further, the Tosefta said, Sadiqim ba'ovdei kochavim, righteous people who are star worshippers. That means they got it totally theologically wrong, but they're good people, there's still a place for them. Sadiqim, right? So we see this notion that all people, if they are righteous, and we'll have to understand what that means, if they're righteous, that there is a place in the world to come. That was in the Tosefta of Sanhedrin, Perek Yud Gimel, and Hilchot Malachim in the Rambam, 8:11. Then we saw in the Gemara that we should feel a sense of trepidation around the question, is there a place in the world to come? We know that modern Jews are always saying, we focus on this world, we don't get too concerned with that. And that is, we will see this idea, but much stronger in the Talmudic tradition is that we should be obsessed with this point. We should wake up every day and realize, I'm going to die at any minute, and I'm going to be judged when I die, and that should impact the way we live our lives. That's the more dominant Talmudic trend. And that should lead us towards Yirat Shamayim, a fear of the heavens, an awe for the heavens. And then we saw in Pesachim, as Rabbi Angel brought in the rat race, this notion that the values and the people that are cherished in this world are oftentimes the exact opposite ones that are mostly valued. And so that is trying to pull us out of a conformity of a bandwagon morality. A sense that if I'm just doing like everyone else around me is doing, I'm okay. And I believe this is one of the main roles of the Jews. With only 12, 13, 14 million of us, whatever there are, in a world of 7 billion, that one of the roles is to say, whoa, we're not like the rest of the world. I mean, we are like the rest of the world as humans, but ultimately we're trying to challenge, trying to turn the flow of the water, trying to agitate on the periphery of society for a different kind of world and a different way of living. One of the main roles of the Jewish people to shake things up a little bit, and I think we're pretty good at that. Then we saw over there in the Zohar this notion that in this world we oftentimes gain our sense of self-worth by our physical appearance, by our wealth, by our pleasure, and these are things that ultimately are not even us. There is a fake us, the Zohar said, that is our embodiment. It is about our physical attraction, it's about our comfort, it's about the things that are ultimately fleeting. We are our souls. And that is our true identity, which has an eternal sense. And more than being rewarded or punished based upon virtue, the question is, did you cultivate that soul? That soul inside of us, is it worthy of continuing? We saw over in Genesis both the idea that immortality was lost, but the Garden of Eden is still maintained, in some sense, as a place of immortality. And that the first source in the Bible is with Abraham, returning to his people, and that Nachum Sarna explains that this is the earliest source for this notion that there is a place we rejoin, not that there's only a heaven, but that we rejoin our relatives. That there is a place of unification with those people we have lost in this life, and even the people we haven't met, who are part of our tradition. And we'll see tremendous stories and agadot, Talmudic narratives that deal with this relationship. Then we saw in Brachot, in the Talmud, that there is that one perception of Olam Haba is that there is no physical experience, and not even an emotional or cognitive experience, but merely a spiritual type of existence. In the Zohar, we were introduced to the idea of Gilgulim, of transmigration, of reincarnation, which we will explore more. And lastly, in Sanhedrin, in Perek Chelek, we saw this idea that there are certain people and beliefs and actions which put people in and out. And that the rabbis are trying to alienate us and make us already more insecure that we're not good Jews and good people than we already felt, as if anybody ever felt secure with their Judaism, from day one. Have you ever heard somebody feel like, yep, I feel like I'm the perfect Jew, we're born with that insecure DNA or convictions. And so the rabbis go on to explain who is in and who is out, and they start drawing those circles in the sand quite a bit. And so I want to pause there for night one, and I'll take just in the remaining 2 minutes questions, which I don't promise to answer, but to note at least to come back to.